Good morning. So as many of you know, I've been here before. Many of you know me. I was raised on a farm in Iowa. My dad still farms there. Pigs put me through college. My first job out of college was a hog and cattle buyer, and I was very upset at the time and now to see the decline of family farm hog production, family chicken production, family ranch beef production. Worked very hard to try to save those, failed in hogs. We're still working on it in cattle. With CPA, which is about rebalancing trade, rebuilding production of manufacturing and agricultural products in the U.S., I see that across industrial sectors, a similar thing is happening. We are importing our oversupply in the name of low consumer prices, which tend to benefit the multinationals, create income inequality, create job deserts, create decline in the rural areas, create decline in urban areas, Detroit, Baltimore, Middle America, South Chicago. You see the income inequality rise, the gutting of the middle class. You see families unable to pay their bills, family breakup. You see the drugs move in. You see just the inability, the decline of communities. And in the countrywide level, you see the decline of a country that is not an industrial production power, as the other powers, Asia, China especially, grew its industrial production and is threatening to overcome us as the geopolitical dominance in Asia and eventually in the world. So that is why I'm doing what I'm doing. You're not in it alone, even though beef producers are a small part of the population. You have a lot of friends that are experiencing the same things. So I have a vision of this country where we have the biggest consumer market in the world, the biggest, wealthiest consumer market in the world. We focus too much on cheap producer or consumer prices, and we've gutted the ability to actually make high wages, rising incomes, and a strong country. We have to rebuild production in this country of agricultural goods, of industrial goods. That is where a high-wage economy comes from. A high-wage economy means your wages and your incomes rise faster than inflation. That means we've got to shift from this focus on cheap consumption to bolstered production. When you bolster production, as we did in early America, in middle of our history, as Germany did, as others did, Japan, Korea, that is the path from poverty to a rich world country, and that's what we have to refigure out now. The arc of history is coming our way, is coming around our way. I will discuss what opportunities we have here. I will discuss how to think about it and what we can do and what you can do in the short term to take advantage of this. So just so you're clear, many of you may not know it, but we have Bill Bullard is on our board at CPA, along with some other agricultural producer representatives and then industries across manufacturing. So Bill, we're right in line with what RCAF is doing. CPA does support MCool, Product of USA in beef. Cool Online, which is something we didn't talk about this week, but we're working on that too. So you have to display country of origin labels on Amazon ads, on any online ads. You don't have to right now. Full inspection of foreign Beef plants, same standards of raising product in other countries as here, because you have high standards here and they let the low standards come in from overseas. And also a ban on Chinese, among other things, a ban on China or Chinese entities buying agricultural land or production operations. So overall, I'm going to talk about the history of the free trade versus building production in the U.S., over our country's history, and a little bit about other countries. I'm going to talk about some recent changes that give us opportunities now and what you can do. Some recent legislation, what you can do. Overall, industrial policy, when you guys are talking about how do we do things in agriculture, we're really talking about industrial policy, although applied to agriculture. We're hearing more of it now. 10, 14 years ago when CPA got started, if you talked about industrial policy, you were Soviet Union central planner. There are no free markets. There is no free trade. It's a myth. It's like a pink unicorn. Everyone likes to talk about it. No one has ever seen one. Across economies, fair trade with China is never going to exist. There are too many differences, too many ways other governments put the thumb on the scale, too many differences in wages, regulatory environment, exchange rates. In my view, forget about free trade and fairness. The game is to win the global competition for good jobs and industries. That's the game. The game is to win in that way. And you need to use, and each of these topics can be a whole talk in and of itself, but 3 steps in industrial policy. You've got to have a tariff policy. You got to broad tariffs to make sure that your production and consumption are balanced. We overconsume and underproduce in this country, which impoverishes us. You've got to have exchange rates aligned. The dollar is way too strong now. It's sucking in imports and preventing exports. You've got to get exchange rates realigned. And you've got to have subsidies. People say, I don't want subsidies because I'm a free person. Well, tell that to China. They're killing us with subsidies, other countries. That's the game. You got to have strategic subsidies, sometimes to get new industries going, sometimes to get some things equated with foreign incentives as well. And we know China has subsidized more, and Brazil has in different ways, more than China has in ways Western economists never thought was possible. They kept saying, if this can't continue, they're going to go broke. Well, they keep eating our lunch. They're not broke in many ways, and they actually keep producing oversupply as a result, which actually keeps prices low. So I'll go through a brief history. The last time I was here, I went through this a bit longer. But from the dawn of our country, the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8 says to Congress they have the duty to do tariffs, among many other things in the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton, in the famous Report on Manufacturers in 1789, said we have to produce the things we need. Implicitly, we cannot rely on the industrial powerhouses of the day in Europe. If we just sell our agricultural goods to them, no offense to agriculture, but you don't want to have a whole economy based on that. They will be the industrial superpower, and they will buy our cotton, our corn, and that's where we'll stay. We'll be a banana republic supplying commodities to Europe, and they will be the superpower, as they were. It was an intentional plan to build production in the U.S. with tariffs, and that would raise prices on, you could say that'll raise prices on us, but overall, when you build production here, your wages rise higher, faster than your prices. That's the game. Your wages and incomes have to rise faster than inflation. That's what they did. They used tariffs, they used incentives, i.e. subsidies for certain industries they wanted. They put together a financial system that was focused on, the goal was to, financial system that built one, we didn't really have one, that incentivized for the finances and the financing to go to production rather than speculation. Our overly financed economy right now is too speculative, too much paper profits, not in production. That's something I won't cover. They're very intentional on that. Washington's first address to Congress included the need to have tariffs. The second bill ever passed in this country was the Tariff Act. During the 1800s, that was the vast majority of tax income was tariffs. Lincoln, Monroe, Jefferson, Madison all got in front of Congress and said, we have to have the tariffs, otherwise we will lose our industry to the economic superpower of the day. Usually was Britain there, but also France. And by 1870, Lincoln said in one of his addresses, which farmer, which merchant, which citizen sees a tax man in our country? All our federal government revenues are paid by tariffs, which are paid by the foreign countries and those in this country who can afford to pay for the luxury goods. We based most of our revenue, we had high tariffs all the way to the 1930s. By 1870, less than 100 years after the Revolutionary War, we were the biggest economy in the world. There was always a lot of debate about it. You had a lot of, folks saying, we'll get rich on exports. We hear that still today. But the data is we got rich by producing for our massive market, dominating our home market, and exporting where it made sense. In 1930 is when it changed. We had the Great Depression. You may have heard of Smoot-Hawley. That raised tariff. They had some tariff cutting in the 19-teens. It went up a bit in the 20s. But we had a financial crisis, stock market crash, and a resulting Great Depression from that financial and monetary crisis. A response to that was Smoot-Hawley to bump up tariffs. If you actually look at the graph, they bumped it up around back to 1914 levels, which wasn't much. And then later, tariff policy was put over to the executive branch. Secretary of State Cordell Hull had the duty to negotiate trade agreements, and from there, the tariff cutting continued through the Great Depression, World War II, in the 1960s, 70s, and today we have the lowest tariffs in the world, and with many countries which we have free trade agreements, we have zero tariffs. We're about 2.5% tariffs. India's about 48% tariffs. Brazil's about 32%. China's in the teens, I think. By the time 1989 came along, that was, you remember, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of history. Capitalism had won. We had won the Cold War. And obviously our modern free trade, free market system prevailed. Well, it did in some ways. Obviously, the Western system was better than the Soviet Union. We then went into NAFTA, and then the WTO in 95. NAFTA was implemented in 94, the WTO in 95, and then China PNTR and WTO membership in 2000. So the 90s were a really pivotal year when we really started incentivizing the import side for our country. And we imported our glut with cattle. What you're seeing is we obviously have antitrust and competition problems in our country. But as they run you out of business, the reason they say, well, we need producers, but they can still get their cattle from overseas, so they import the glut, they import the oversupply from somewhere else. So you got to have more than a closed economy analysis of it. But we see analysis of it. We see it in steel, we see it in chips, we see it in pharmaceuticals, we see it in solar panels, we see it in computers and electronics. The decline is here. The production shifts overseas. We still have low prices for a while. But then what's changed? That worked. The consumer was happy. The consumer lost their jobs, but it was hard to say. You could always say, well, if you have tariffs on an industry, you'll get a few more jobs, a few higher wages, but everybody in the country will pay higher prices. So it's better for everybody to have lower prices. And we kept losing that argument. Remember, when you're reading, I'm going to come back to it, when you're reading the paper and they talk about prices and they talk about consumer welfare, it's all about a neoliberal consumption-based focus where low prices will make you rich. You build a country and you get rich on low consumer prices. That's what all the economic analysis is based on. That's implicit in most financial press and most of the business press. And it's turning now to the need for a production focus where building production will make you rich, and that's what's happened. Germany did it in the 1830s to become the biggest economy in Europe. They also, like us, made the choice not to rely on England and France. They put up barriers so that German industry could build. They became a big economic powerhouse in the continent, caused 2 world wars with that economic power, of course, but they still have that history now. Japan, after World War II, was a poor, war-torn society that, of course, they were decimated by World War II for good reason. They could have said, oh, we have such poor people, we have to import the cheap stuff from the US and other industrialized countries. They didn't. They protected their markets, built their industry, and almost, we were afraid they were going to be the new economic superpower in the 80s. South Korea, after the Korean War, same thing. War-torn, impoverished country, we better buy cheap stuff from overseas. It's really expensive to build our own industry, our own auto industry, et cetera. They didn't. They built production, became among the first world countries. China did it in its own way, through exchange rate manipulation, through subsidies, through tariffs, through very intentional plans, 5-year plans to target industries and build them. They've been very successful at it, and we happily continued on the sugar high of low prices even as many of our industries went away and our trade deficit ballooned, and it's going to be higher than it ever has been this year than ever before. So what's changed is, first, Trump came, and whether you're a Trump or a Biden or a Republican or Democrat, Trump, warts and all, and Lighthizer put tariffs up. Everyone freaked out. Consumers are going to lose. We're going to have inflation. We're going to have all kinds of economic problems, and it wasn't even a blip. Tariffs on China, tariffs on steel, tariffs on solar panels. In all those cases with steel, investment and jobs went up in steel. Steel prices kept pretty similar to pre-tariff prices a few years back. In solar panels, they put tariffs on Chinese subsidized solar panels, and then worldwide, solar panel prices, despite freakouts that we won't have any solar deployment in this country, solar panels will go way up. The prices kept coming down. They kept coming down, but U.S. factory capacity, instead of going extinct, really started ramping up. Same with clothes washers, tariffs on clothes washers. It's going to be horrible for the consumer. Clothes washer prices are going to go way up because Samsung and LG, actually from South Korea, were subsidizing and breaking trade rules, and we put it on them. And then we had to do it globally because they were country hopping everywhere. Didn't happen there. Tariffs on Chinese goods, about half of Chinese imports, because of their intellectual property theft. That would be the worst. The Peterson Institute, all the free traders, all the libertarians said everything's going to go wrong in 2018. It just simply did not. At that time, in the ancient era before COVID, what happened is we gave our producers a chance to recover, just as if we blocked certain parts of cattle imports, you guys would all produce more and fill the difference. That's what would happen. That's what happened in the other sectors. And so the neoliberals have been morally delegitimized now than they ever have been, in part starting because of their hyperventilating claims that did not come true. You have a few studies where they tortured data in their basement, said the U.S. consumer paid all the tariffs. That is impossible in theory and did not happen in fact. Then COVID happened. And we didn't have enough PPE. We didn't have enough medical device capability. We didn't have enough medicines. We have shortages of 200 or so essential medicines. Everyone says, why don't we produce it here? You know, sorry for the slang, but duh. You weren't paying attention. And so COVID, the silver lining is that people paid more attention to the need to be more self-reliant in many different areas. Medicines, medical devices, PPE. Government started putting out money to get, even some of my members, to get cotton swabs, to get hospital gowns, to get masks out. You know, the mask makers, you know, the hospitals wouldn't buy. They were all bottom feeding with Chinese masks, you know, at a third the price. Why don't we have masks? Well, you wouldn't return the call. So the government helped rebuild some mask making capacity, put production lines, gloves, medical gloves, same thing. Short-lived memory, but it's been durable. You had the free traders in Congress don't look good anymore. Now it's okay to be the global supply chains. If you're talking global supply chains, you look more like an idiot than you did in 2014, if that's your master plan. Now today, the mask makers are still having a problem after the, you know, you had the big demand for masks because of COVID. It's coming off. They sort of built capacity. Others did. China came back online. 71 countries during COVID cut off exports because people said, oh no, it's horrible for free trade. But the fact is, your duty as a government is first to your citizens. And that's what they all did, like it or not. So in a crisis, we realize we're in bad shape. Some short memories because the mask makers now can't get a return call because the hospital procurement people are now bottom feeding back in China again. So we got to have something in here where, you know, the VA hospitals, DOD, maybe Medicare, Medicaid have to reimburse only for USA-made masks, USA-made gloves, USA-made pharmaceuticals. But we're 80% reliant on India and China for active pharmaceutical ingredients. We don't produce antibiotics here. We don't produce a lot of generics here. They're very unsafe, just like the cattle is very unsafe, very horror stories. We're working on that very hard. I mean, you bottom feed, you get it cheap. The FDA does not inspect these plants in Hyderabad, India, or in China. They have water leaks in these plants. These are like supposed to be totally, I've been through high quality plants here, our members. You get water in a plant, that is 100% guarantee of bacteria. You have urine pails on the floor in the production area, and these people are still sent, the FDA is still allowing this in. So that's COVID. Then we had the Ukraine war happen, and the boycotts, and China supporting Russia, and you know, we're getting you know, Germany's seeing what it's like to be excessively relying on Russia for their commodities and their energy. We have now Taiwan issue. The likelihood of China going into Taiwan in the next 5 or 10 years is very high. It's far more foreseeable than COVID. We have first strike capability against China. After that, we don't because we're too reliant for chips, many ammunition, a lot of military and a lot of civilian military fusion items. They could shut down our economy. So that is very serious. What we've seen now this year, so the national security part of reshoring is more significant than it ever has been. Now we do have the inflation right now, which people are afraid of being as aggressive as they might otherwise be in reshoring. But the inflation now is two things. Number one, we put out a lot of money, a lot of helicopter money, so people had more money in their pockets to buy stuff. But inflation is global. The big part of inflation is the supply chain shock of the war and the whole disruptions. We know when you have global supply chains and we have the disruption of COVID or war in Ukraine and war in Taiwan, that is driving the inflation. It is the manganese, it is the stainless steel, it is the nickel, it is the oil, it is the natural gas. You've got to have a way, you've got to have a plan. So we've got to have American-made energy, we've got to have American-made food, American-made medical goods, American-made semiconductors or allied-made. You've got to have your supplies right. They've got to be, so we really should be in World War II industrial policy stage right now to deal with the national security issues, or we are in a big trouble. And if and when China invades Taiwan and all the strategic cutoffs of things we really need from China happen, we have huge inflation, huge job displacement, the stock market crash. The stock market and market effect of that will make what happened in the markets due to the Ukraine war look like a one-day downturn. So that's why you're seeing right now, this year, you still have, what you're seeing this year, the whole thing of, no, we don't want to touch the markets. We want the markets to make the decision, and we'll just be the umpire in fairness. You know what? That's just totally naive in this world. Everyone puts the thumb on the scale. You got to have goals to produce. You got to be reliant. You got to have enough domestic reliance or allied reliance where it is. And we got to have critical minerals. We've got to have pharmaceuticals. We got to have advanced batteries. And so we saw the CHIPS Act happen this year, and people said, oh, we can't subsidize these big companies. Well, we do. We have to make it so it's cheaper to build a plant in the US than in China or in Taiwan. We just do. We need the chips, not only the high-end, the advanced, but there's scores of SKUs, different versions of chips that are the basis of our economy. And if we don't have it, it's a real problem. Now, it's not a problem, it's a catastrophe. So putting some money, and that's conditioned on building plant and equipment here in Columbus, in Ohio, in Texas, whatever. That's what we want. That's how China got Intel and the auto plants over there, is they subsidized the plant, so it was a cheap place to put a plant and they could take advantage of it. We've got to do that, and it's not inflationary, it is disinflationary because it produces more supply in relation to demand. When your supply crashes, your inflation goes up, remember? Now, for solar panels, now in the Inflation Reduction Act, I know that's been a big partisan freak out, but and we're bipartisan. We've got strong Republicans, we got strong Democrats, but they're subsidizing now with tax credits the whole solar supply chain. Polysilicon, it goes polysilicon to ingots to wafers to cells to the solar modules, and we have some solar manufacturing members, and we know we worked hard to get that thing passed, and we know now as a result there's going to be very, very large industrial production plant announcements, billions coming as a result of that. It's really moving the needle. With cattle and beef, you've got to move the needle so it is more competitive to produce here than to import from somewhere else. Raise the cost or slow it from overseas, but produce here because we've got to get back. We know the country's not going to have a catastrophe if we're back to 1980 levels of domestic market share for cattle, because we've already lived through that. We've got coming up, we're going to have to get it. So the tariffs were the Trump era preferred. We've got to get comfortable with tariffs. We just came out with a model tariff schedule last week showing how we did full economic modeling showing how it's a pro-growth model, how wages and incomes rise faster than inflation under tariffs, and how big job gains, big domestic investment gains. Now, I'm not saying that's going to change the game right now, because there's so much history of neoliberal cheap consumption, get it from wherever. But we're starting that. But you got to have the tariffs. The Biden administration right now is more comfortable with incentives and subsidies. I'm comfortable with it. You should be comfortable because that's how the game is played. And if you don't have it, other countries are going to eat your lunch. We've got to get exchange rates under control as well. So right now, the big opportunity, as I mentioned, is national security. You've got to hitch your wagon to the big national issues. Otherwise, just steel, just beef, just antibiotics isn't enough to make it a national issue that will move through legislation. So national security, trade, and industrial rebuilding is a national security issue. Everyone gets it. Forced labor is another overarching issue that is driving the cutoff of imports of tomatoes, of cotton, of textiles, of solar panels, that sort of thing. It's a widely agreed upon issue. Yes, we want cheap goods. Yes, we want to save the climate, but you're going to do it on the back of slave labor from Uyghurs' concentration camps in China, from Tibetan forced labor, from Falun Gong forced labor in China. So that's another thing that's not quite directly relevant to you, but it is in a lot of places. Supply chain resiliency is a big thing. And with you've got the risk of animal diseases. You've got some other risk. You've got to have supply chain resiliency. You've got the environment. So when you have the environmental movement, we can get back to pre-1980 levels of cattle production in an environmentally friendly way here. We don't have to cut down the Amazon to do it. If we're going to rely on Brazil for the future of cattle and beef, we're going to cut down, half the Amazon? So part of it, you can say, if you're pro-environment, you want to produce more beef here. If you're pro-environment, you want to refine more copper here. Otherwise, you're going to refine it in China, which produces the Asian brown cloud, which you can see from space float across the Pacific and across the world. If you are pro-offshoring, you hate the climate, you hate the environment. That is factually true. If you don't want to find a way to get cobalt from somewhere besides Congo, you are pro-child labor because children are digging with their hands cobalt out of open mines and making it possible for you to have your iPhones. We need to build the critical mineral supply chain. We have to mine here and get permitting right so we can do it, a net pollution reduction and a net benefit to labor as well as our country. We want to have prevention of inflation. We now know that supply chain shock inflation puts our inflation up to 9%, puts Britain's inflation up to 13%, and we need to get supply back so we do not have those risks if and when the Chinese invasion of Taiwan happens or the eventual decoupling happens, because Chairman Xi is going to get a third term. He's going to be chairman for life, and he's never going to be nicer to us. Those who tried to say we're going to have diplomacy, agreements, and cooperation with them look like idiots now, and less people are listening to them. The China threat, we fund China with the biggest bilateral trade deficit surplus, depending on which side you are, in the history. China just hits its biggest trade surplus, monthly trade surplus last month, the biggest monthly trade surplus of any country ever in history of 101 billion. We are on track to be the biggest trade deficit in the world, or in the history of our country and the world this year. Part of China's reliance on us for their wealth is because their own domestic consumption is so weak. They don't have enough consumption in their internal market to grow. We do. If we increase our domestic market share and dominate our home market, we will be clearly the biggest economic superpower in the world for the foreseeable future. If we cut off China over time from access to our market, they will go the way of Japan with, at best, the lost decade stagflation that Japan experienced in the 90s, because they can't do it through domestic production. And there's no other country in the world willing to take their oversupply like we are. Europe won't do it, and other countries are too small. So if we decouple, they are done without firing a shot. So these are very big things, very clear answers. We have to keep getting little victories to get a high-wage economy, to prevent future inflation, to maintain our geopolitical power, to repopulate economically the job deserts we've created in Baltimore, South Chicago, Detroit, Middle America, and rural America. So getting MCOOL is important. Getting more, you'll see more supply chain transparency, because now they try to hide where the forced labor comes into their textiles or comes into the solar panels or other things. So we're going to see more opportunity in the industrial goods sector to get supply chain transparency. You should look for it in agriculture. So let's try to get some wins this fall with MCOOL, with Cool Online, with Product of the USA. Let's increasingly support tariffs, do the message that more production here is good for our country, it's good for our consumers, it's good for our wages, and we want a high-wage economy. We already, and oh, by the way, neoliberals, we already tried your way. It didn't work. Let's go and rebuild our country. So thank you, and I'll take any questions.
This is a naive question, but shouldn't our CAF's goal be zero beef imports? Shouldn't that be our long-term goal? Or is that economically suicide?
Oh, my current view is what China did and what Japan did and what Korea did is first in sectors they were successful, they first dominate the home market. And they get economies of scale. At those scales, you get a per unit price that is pretty low, and then you can try to do the export market. So long as we produce less beef than we consume under that standard, you obviously would want to basically export nothing, on net, and supply as much of the home market as you can. And then it's a matter of increasing production to roughly equal consumption. And then if you can increase, barring other things, so that you can reasonably export, that's fine. But if you can't, I'll put it this way. You want to have a goal of increasing domestic market share. We actually, with CPA, created the first ever domestic market share index for manufactured goods and found, no surprise, the line since 1990 to now was a 10% reduction in domestic market share. We're losing on the home field advantage. That loss of 10%, we're at about what, 65? Our U.S. production in goods is about 65% of our country, what we consume. Was 75% back then. That's $700 billion. That's the size of Saudi Arabia's economy. So yeah, you want to dominate your home market. If we don't produce as much as we consume, you're going to import some. But I think of it that way. Sir.
Mike, what success have you had in talking to labor unions about your program?
Well, labor unions were a part of the founding of CPA. Labor, your best friends, so labor unions have three major parts. You've got the public employees unions, which work for governments. Trade's really not their issue. You got the service sector employees, which are not industrial unions. Trade's really not their issue, but the industrial unions it is. You know, mine workers, auto workers, steel workers, they've long been a leader on trade. So they're largely with us. They're not free traders. They're fair traders. I think they're coming around. I'm a strategic trader. I don't know what fairness means. And I don't think you can try to get fairness with very different other economies and governments, and exchange rates and banking systems and regulatory systems and labor markets and et cetera. But they're helpful. I say the steel workers are probably the best. So they're largely our friend. And they obviously want more production back here.
We got time for one more.
Michael, so glad that you could share your perspective on trade and our economy. But one of our frustrations as RCAF is when they renegotiated NAFTA to UMCR, that Greg Dowd, I mean, you talked about Peter Navarro and steel, the tariffs, what Trump did to steel and solar panels, but from a food security standpoint, we got nothing as beef producers out of the renegotiation of NAFTA. And so how do we approach that? And you call them neoliberals. Greg Dowd probably wouldn't consider himself a neoliberal, but how do we get past...
neoliberal is different than liberal and conservative, but go ahead.
Okay, but how do we get past somebody like that? I don't know if Catherine Tai understands it or not. But
Catherine Tai is good. She's the second best USTR we've ever had after Lighthizer. But yeah, under the Trump administration, still big, you know, the big multinational cattle and beef organizations were still dominant in the Purdue USDA. Not quite so much under Vilsack. You have some opportunities. I can't explain that, but you want to get right now, you want to make sure that you get things like MCOOL. You want to get the product of the USDA. You want to get support Andy Green's work on the packers and stockyard side. Focus on what you can get now, and for the rest of it, I share your, you know, for me, you know, NAFTA should go away. USMCA should go away. Every country should be able to control its own economy and advance and grow according to its own resources, its culture, its goals, that sort of thing. And yeah, I don't want to outsource our trade policy to Geneva. Oh, one other thing. I mean, that's what we've done. We've outsourced our trade policy to Geneva. One brilliant thing Lighthizer did is kill the Geneva appellate body, so they can't do a judicial, you know, function anymore, and they can't do negotiating function anymore. There's just too many different countries in that. The WTO is probably most likely going to be like the UN. It's going to be some debating body in some other country that nobody pays attention to anymore. That's starting to happen more, and I'll say in this Inflation Reduction Act, what was very interesting is the EV tax credit, which I'm sure all of you followed very closely. I'm joking. But the EV tax credit is what you buy an electric vehicle, has been that you buy an electric vehicle, you get a $7,500 rebate as a consumer. And they set it up so that different companies, you know, if you sell, what, 200,000 cars, you get 700, you know, 200,000, that's 7,500 rebate, and then you max out, and you don't get any more. So as of this year, under the old program, that rebate gave rebates for 0 American EVs. And it only subsidized foreign-made EVs. Can you believe it? And we would raise the alarm about that for a little bit. Somebody actually heard us, because in this bill, what they did is they made that EV tax credit only available to cars that were made in North America. So that's Canada, US, Mexico. But look, we make like, I don't know, China's going to making about 5 million EVs a year now. They're going to be 15 million. I think we do several 100,000. I mean, they're going to be massive. They're going to swamp us like you've never seen in a lot of things, but including that. So first, you'd only get half of that tax credit, $37,500, whatever it is, half of it if it's made in North America, and then the other half if the batteries are made with materials within the FTA countries. What's very significant, it'd be nice to be all US, but to squeeze out China is a really big deal. And that's a WTO, clearly a WTO violation, because the WTO, China is a WTO country, Europe is WTO. To say that that tax credit isn't allowed to WTO country goods is a clear violation of the WTO. Congress has never wanted to do that before. I'm sure all the Buy America programs would violate WTO rules because we're not allowing, same preference for WTO countries that sign on to a certain agreement. You got to treat them all the same. And that's the way they've done it. Buy America is really buy 48 other countries' stuff with a preference for government procurement. So it's very significant that they did it without a peep. Europe is going to probably sue us at WTO. But that's the first time the U.S. Congress, that I can remember, has passed legislation like that with a clear WTO violation. So I think we're on track to just doing our own industrial policy and don't care what the WTO says. That actually augurs well for MCOOL. Screw what the WTO says. We're just going to label here. It was a stupid decision anyway. I mean, what a cockamamie decision they made. This is on our side. We keep chipping away at it, chipping away. I want the WTO to go away. Lighthizer as USTR, killing the appellate body, you think, well, what do I care? That's chipping away, chipping away. And so that's how the arc of history isn't going to be a revolution to us, but it's going to keep going. We keep getting our wins, keep showing that we win this, we win that. We get polling right, what we're doing at CPA. We get some, digital campaigns. We try to up our campaigns, et cetera, et cetera. I could go on. I'm way over time. But I feel really optimistic, and all your work is paying off more and more, so thanks for all you do.